All right, welcome everyone. So our presentation today is on sensory awareness and mindfulness. This is a presentation for you as a parent or caregiver. And we're going to go through some activities you can do at home, or if you are a counselor, a therapist, and you're here and you are interested in activities for your therapeutic setting, you're going to be able to duplicate those in that sort of space as well. My name is Jessica Ragno. I am a clinical social worker and the associate clinical director at Mightier. We try to do one of these every month with a little bit of a different topic and different playful activity set around how you're going to work on a specific skill with the children that you care for and support. Our agenda for today, we are going to look at specifically at the commonly referenced sensory profile model. We're going to really dig into this and understand the quadrants and how this might apply for your child and for yourself. If you are a Mightier family, you know that everything we do is for kids and for their caregivers, right? It's so important that as you help your child build emotional awareness, that you're doing this alongside with them to provide some modeling, but also to give you a frame of reference. Then we are going to run through specific senses and put them through the model. And we're going to redo it and look specifically at how is tactile input different from auditory input in terms of how someone responds and processes and what they need. And then we're going to go through the activity set that I have for you, and I'm going to share out at the end of this. These activities are really meant to help kids build awareness of their sensory profile, their needs, how they respond to things, and practice sensory-based mindfulness. Really with the goal here that everyone is different, and we want to set up a model so that kids can explore and figure out what these things mean for themselves and build that self-awareness and then self-regulation strategies off of that. All right, so first we're going to start with Winnie Dunn's sensory processing framework. If you've been concerned about sensory processing for your child, or your child's in occupational therapy, you might be familiar with this framework already. This is the generalized view of this, and then we're going to get into the specific senses and how we would put them through this model. So there's a lot on here. The way this model works is it breaks up types of sensory thresholds and then how you respond and regulate based off of your threshold into quadrants. So if you look on that vertical axis, that's running from a high neurological threshold for a specific type of sensory input to a low threshold. So in essence, how big is your cup, right? If you are on that higher end, you have a pretty large cup, right, for sensory information. You can tolerate a lot, you can handle a lot. It takes a lot more for your needs to be met. So oftentimes you might think hyposensitivity. You're less sensitive to the input coming in. You need more than someone else who's lower down on that spectrum. If you're on that low side, the low threshold, your cup is smaller, right? You don't need as much sensory input to have your needs met, or you feel everything really quickly and intensely, right? You are hypersensitive to those pieces of sensory information. So you either can't tolerate enough, you need less, or every little bit, you feel it more intensely than someone who's on that higher end of the spectrum. The way we're running horizontally is based off of your regulation tendencies. How do you automatically respond and behave based off of your needs? So on the left, we have passive regulation tendencies. So this is more you aren't necessarily noticing what you need or doing anything to self-regulate. The things are happening to you. And you might be a little more reactive to them versus someone who's on the more active regulation side and they are going after what they need. We'll go through the quadrants and this will make a little more sense. So let's look at the top left corner. This is someone who's And these are the names that are in this model. So I'm just going to use the names that it's been given. This is someone in like the bystander quadrant. So this person has a high threshold. Their cup is very big. They can handle a lot of sensory information. They need a lot of sensory input, but they're not necessarily doing anything about it. They're not automatically seeking it out. They're hyposensitive to the information coming into them. And so they might not just be functioning at their best in those moments, right? They probably need a little more to feel regulated. So what this might look like is they might be missing some cues. They might seem distracted because they actually need a bit more. Go to the right. This is our seeker, our sensory seeker. You might know this child. This is someone who they can handle a lot of sensory input. They need a lot of sensory input. They need more in order to like feel like they're getting their fill, and feel like regulated. And they're going after it, right? This is a child that maybe can like seem a bit wild. They're unaware of their body and space and others. And they're moving fast. They're touching things, right? Like this is a child who is seeking out that sensory input because they need it. And they're not like intentionally or cognitively necessarily knowing that they're doing that, but like their body is just responding naturally in that way. Let's go to the bottom left. This is our sensor. Which is a strange name for one piece of a quadrant that's all about sensory stuff. But this person can't handle as much, right? Their cup is smaller. They don't need as much sensory input to have their needs met. But they're not necessarily automatically avoiding it. So they can feel overwhelmed easily. If they're in a setting that is really overstimulating, there's a lot of sensory information going on around them, they might get to that point of overwhelm and start and react to that before their body really noticed and told them like, hey, whoa, like this is too much. We need to get out of here, right? So they're kind of like stuck in that like responding to it a little too late. Versus move to the right. This is our avoider. This is someone who, again, can't handle as much sensory input, doesn't need as much, feels everything pretty intensely, and they are automatically avoiding it. So they are going out of their way to avoid the sensory information that is not comfortable, not pleasing to them, right? This might be your picky eater, someone who it might seem like they're going against social norms, they're covering their ears, like things like this that are actually just them trying to regulate or in the environment that is maybe overstimulating to them. So in general, everyone, go to the next slide. Everyone has a sensory profile, right? We all sit somewhere on that, you could be kind of like in the middle. I'd say most neurotypical folks are like somewhere in the middle, right? But we all have a sensory profile, and it's really important and help in understanding what yours is, what your child's is, and helping your child understand what theirs is, because it then helps us understand like what's going on in our body. Why are we feeling this way? Why are we acting this way? What do we need, right? If we can understand how our brain and body work, we are setting ourselves up to have more self-awareness and to be better able to self-regulate down the line. So just to quickly review like some definitions in what we just went over. So seeking is like that degree to which a person is actively trying to obtain sensory input, versus avoiding, which is that degree to which a person is actively avoiding sensory input. Sensitivity is the degree to which a person detects sensory input. So how sensitive are you to it? How much do you notice it? And registration, the degree to which a person misses sensory input. How to use this in general and like apply this to the last slide we looked at and to the things we're going to talk about going forward. So sensory processing is a concept that explains how we experience life through our senses. This sensory profile is meant to help you identify sensory preferences. This is not about diagnosis. This is not about labels. This is about understanding your preferences. And based on that, knowing what your sensory threshold is and those preferences and how you tend to respond and what you need, that is going to help in terms of self-regulation down the line. All right. So this is a typical breakdown that I imagine many people here are familiar with, like this comparison between like the sensory seeker and the sensory avoider, right? So largely the two quadrants that were top right and bottom right in that profile. So your sensory seeker, like loves jumping, running, crashing into things. They're chewing on things. Like they might always have like their shirt sleeve in their mouth, chewing on their toothbrush. They are loud or they like loud noises, right? Like they like having that auditory input. They really might like deep pressure, massage. They like to spin, be upside down. They might be fidgeting with their hands a lot or have a hard time sitting still, right? Like their body likes to be moving, shifting position. They might play rough. They might not have like a great sense of how forceful their body is in play situations with other kids, or how like fast they're running and like bump against the wall, things like that. They might stand really close to the TV. This is different from like someone who is on that more sensory avoidant side, who is trying to control for a lot of those things. So there are certain textures and tastes that bother them. So maybe this comes off as like they're a picky eater. They avoid certain textures of food or certain textures of clothing. They're more physically cautious. They're sensitive to certain smells, and they may avoid strong smells. They may call you out if they notice that you have a strong scent. They prefer quieter environments. They cover their ears when things are loud. They might need like the tags cut out of their shirts. They don't like being touched, tickled. They may dislike swinging or being on like the high part of the playground, or going down the slide. You could also be somewhere in the middle. And part of being somewhere in the middle is the fact that we just talked about a bunch of different types of sensory input, and how a child experiences each type can be different. So that's what we're going to get into right now. And I apologize. I really did want to find little leveling sketches to include along this whole presentation, but we didn't have any good ones for all of these. So first, we're going to talk about auditory input, so auditory processing and your response. So looking at same grid, same model. If we look at our bystander, right? So someone who has a high threshold for auditory input, top left here, they need more. It takes more for it to register and feel fulfilling for them. So this is someone who may not, it doesn't seem like they're following verbal directions well, or they don't seem to be listening, right? Because it just takes more auditory input for them in order for these things to register. Versus our seeker, who again has that high threshold, high need, can tolerate a lot. And they're putting on the extra noise, right? They have the background noise on to help improve their focus. They're making extra noise. This might be the person in your office who is playing music loudly in a public space, right? They need the extra stimulation in order to get their needs met. Bottom left here, we have our sensor. So this is a person who has like smaller cup, lower threshold for auditory sensory input. They feel it, right? They sense it really intensely. They might be bothered or distracted by loud noises or by too many noises. And therefore, they're going to have trouble focusing, and they're reactive to it, right? So they're not necessarily like cutting those things off or like preemptively problem solving there, but like when it happens, then they're getting overwhelmed, and they're feeling that response, which oftentimes can be an emotional response as well. Bottom right, we have our avoider. So this is someone who, again, doesn't need much, doesn't want much auditory sensory input. They're bothered and distracted by all those noises, and they're covering their ears. They're wearing their headphones to tune out that background noise and help them focus, right? They're doing things proactively to manage that. Let's look at tactile. We're not going to go through all the senses here. I'm just going to go through a few. But let's look at tactile input and therefore processing and response. So top left, our bystander, like they can handle a need a lot of tactile sensation, right? Like they need their fill, but they're not getting it and they're not going after it necessarily. So they're also, because of that hyposensitivity, they may not be aware of like being touched or even like getting a cut or something, right? Like it doesn't register as much for them. Versus our seeker, who can handle more, they need more, and they're looking for it. They are wearing tighter clothing. They're touching everything. They're chewing on things. They're just like seeking out that tactile input in a variety of ways. Bottom left, our sensor, so they don't need as much. They're bothered or distracted by certain tactile sensations, and they're reacting strongly. They might become dysregulated or can't focus when there's too much happening around them, right? So they kind of get to that point of overwhelm before dealing with it. And then our avoider, bottom right. So again, doesn't need so much, feels everything very intensely. And they're doing things to manage that right off the bat. So they're like refusing to wear certain clothes or fabrics. They might not like showers or having their hair brushed. They're avoiding foods with certain textures, right? All of those things would fall into the tactile category. We're going to talk about interoception. So this is not a sense that is typically talked about. If you're a My Dear Family, you may have actually come across our interoception skill pack, signals from inner space, we called it. So interoception is your awareness and interpretation of internal body cues. This is, I have to go to the bathroom, I'm hungry, because I'm angry, my heart is racing, my stomach feels sick, my muscles are tight, right? It is the internal body cues and sensations, your ability to notice them and interpret what they mean. So it applies to like everyday bodily functions and to our emotional state. This is very important. This is actually like one of the first layers of building emotional awareness, is noticing like what's going on internally in your body. This is also a skill that a lot of kids who have sensory processing difficulties are also going to struggle with. So we want to build awareness around this. We want to practice it. To go through this model, thinking about interoceptive input, our bystander, so again, needs a lot of input, not very sensitive to the input they receive. So they have a little awareness of their internal body sensations. So they might not recognize like the stomach ache. They might not feel the stomach ache until too late, right? Or they might not recognize like, oh, that's actually really anxiety. Or they might miss their cues for hunger or needing to go to the bathroom, right? They're so busy doing something else that they forget that they haven't eaten in 10 hours, and then we're in meltdown mode, right? Because we needed to eat. This is different from our seeker, who again needs more of this and is hyposensitive to those internal cues. And therefore they're pushing their body a little more in order to get their fill. So this might look like the kid who seems to push their body to more extreme limits physically, or can sit at like higher levels of emotional intensity. So like, for example, like anger doesn't feel good necessarily in your body, and you can feel it pretty intensely when you're angry. But this would be a child who seems to be able to get to higher and more intense levels of anger before it really like registering with them, right? Because they're not picking up on the cues as easily. The cues need to be more intense for them. Bottom left here, we have our sensor. So they're hyper aware of those internal body sensations, but they're a little more passive about what they're doing about it. So this might be the child who like feels things quickly, like they're anxious, they have a stomach ache, they're in the nurse's office, they're complaining of pain, right? Like things really manifest in their body quickly. And I'd say for a lot of kids, they don't know what these feelings mean all the time, right? Like this is a pretty advanced concept that we need to help kids understand. So a lot of times kids will know that like that anxiety and that stomach ache I'm feeling actually is because of my emotions. Bottom right, we have our avoider. Again, hyper aware of those internal body sensations. and doing something to manage them. So this might be the child who's like changing their clothes all the time because they're controlling for temperature, or they're taking deep breaths because they noticed that their breathing is shallow or their heart is racing, right? And so they're like trying to calm themselves down, or they're avoiding certain foods because they know that whenever they eat this, whatever, like their stomach feels a little sick, like so they're not going to eat that thing anymore. Okay, and then one last one we're going to look at and look at it a little differently is we're going to look at the vestibular sense. So if you think of like your inner ear and the sense that gives you, this is like your sense of balance, body's position, movement through space. So if you think about like how your body feels when you like go up an escalator, right? Or you're like on a boat, right? Like how you feel on a swing, like these things have to do with like that inner ear sense. So and we're just going to go through a bunch of examples with this one is why it's set up differently. Someone who has like a really high threshold isn't as sensitive, so like needs a little more and is seeking more input, more vestibular input. This might be the kid who loves jumping, running, going really fast. They love climbing or being held up really high. They love spinning, they're swinging, they're tumbling, they're rolling, they're upside down, they're sitting in their chair upside down for some reason. They seem really coordinated and have to have really good balance, right? So we see this in a lot of kids and how they move and how they act and how they play. And on the other side, someone who has a lower threshold and tolerance for that vestibular input, doesn't need as much, doesn't want as much, and is hypersensitive to that input and is avoiding it. That might look like they don't like being picked up. They may seem uncoordinated. They're more physically cautious. They may not like going up and down the stairs. Elevators and escalators don't feel good for them. Swinging doesn't feel good. Being high up on playground equipment or going down a slide, like those things don't feel good for them. So they're going to avoid those situations. So this is, let me see, I think we get into our activities next. Yep. All right. So there are other senses, of course. What we just went through is just sort of how to use that overall model of the sensory profile and those quadrants, but like plug each sense into it, because how your child responds to vestibular input may be different from how they respond to tactile input, right? Like, so it makes sense. We can't like lump all things sensory into like one basket. We have to separate them out by the different sense types. All right, so now we're going to get to the activities that I'm going to share out with you afterwards. But here I'm just going to talk you through what they are and like the different approach each one is taking to help your child build a skill. If you've seen our activities before, you know that we like to wrap everything up in a metaphor, and then we deliver this is actually from a curriculum unit, so there are a few more things in here that feel a bit worksheety, but in general, we're using crafts, we're using games, we're using movement-based activities, we're using some art. So the metaphor for this activity pack is like, we call it our super sensor pack, and it's like animals in the jungle. We're using animals as the metaphor because it's really easy to focus in on a specific animal and like a sense that is really strong for them and the purpose of that sense for them, because we want to, as step one, call kids' attention to the fact that like your senses, like, yes, of course, you probably know your 5 senses, and those are really important to you. And they serve like huge functions for you and how you navigate the world around you. And we want to think about them very specifically and play with them very specifically. And we want to get to know how you feel and respond to different types of sensory input. We want to know what feels good and what doesn't. This is all about building self-awareness. So step one is just introducing kids to their senses through this metaphor. This is also where we introduce kids to the idea of mindfulness. So mindfulness here just being the practice of like slowing down, focusing very intentionally on something. it could be on your thoughts. For this, we're specifically focusing on sensory information and how it makes your body feel, right? That's how we're using mindfulness in these activities. So first, we have like sensory survival skills. We're trying to just help kids make the connection of like, okay, what is the purpose of the things you hear, right? Like name a sound that alerts you and helps you pay attention, things like that, like little prompts to get you to think about like, oh, right, like my senses really do have, each one has a purpose. The game here that you see on the right is sensory surprise. I think probably a lot of parents have played this game before where you have to close your eyes and your kid brings you a thing and you have to guess what it is based off of like smelling it or like listening to it. It's that game, basically. Try to use your senses to guess what an object or a food is. And this also lets us get goofy. Like kids are going to bring weird things for you to guess. So hopefully we bring a little bit of fun into this. The next, so that's all just like, you have senses, let's play with them. Next level is let's introduce kids a little bit to that sensory profile, some of the ideas in it, through a loveling. So this Stu is our loveling for this pack. Stu really is on that like lower threshold side, gets overwhelmed with a lot of sensory input and information. There are a few Stu activities that you're going to get in this pack. One of them is looking through the situations that Stu is in and trying to figure out what was going on for him and what he needed in that moment in order to feel calmer and like more regulated. There's also a drawing activity in here where your child can like take one of these examples or make up their own and like take Stu through being like overwhelmed, dealing with a lot of sensory information to calming down, feeling more regulated. Next, we have a sensory scavenger hunt. So this is a little bit more about getting to know your sensory profile. So the way we have this set up, and we have a few prompts, and I'm going to encourage you to like probably make your own version of this based off of what you already know about your child and what they kind of like how you want to prompt them to think about things based off of what you've already noticed about them. The way we have this set up is that there's a prompt. We ask kids to identify what sense they are using, what they're noticing, and then how it makes them feel. So one of the prompts here is scratch your nails on a rug or chalkboard, right? For a lot of us, that is really unpleasant. Like there's a tactile sensation there. There might be like an auditory sensation, right? And a lot of us are going to say like, oh, like we don't like that. That's a very unpleasant sensation. Does anyone like that? I don't know. But like the point of this is to go through things that will be more pleasing and calming, things that might be activating, things that might be unpleasant, right? Just to get to know yourself. And again, this is for your child to do. This is for you to do. Your answers are probably going to be different from one another. And that's a really good point of conversation. You talk about that. You laugh about that, right? And again, I encourage you to make your own prompts as well, or even have your child make some, like that could be fun, so that this does really apply to some things in your real life. And then this bonus round activities are like a little more directive around like find a texture that irritates you and bothers you. What is it? Think of a texture that's calming. What is it? So these things are really laying out in a way that will probably be very helpful in understanding, like, I don't like wearing this. I do like wearing this. I don't like these sorts of sounds, but I do like these sorts of sounds, right? It's really helpful for you and your child to understand that about them, so that, because oftentimes we're stuck in the responding to it state, right? We're having a hard time, we're overwhelmed, and we're reacting to that rather than knowing that like, oh, it was this because it was because of this sensory element around us that we could have solved for. All right, and then the last piece, this is a shorter presentation today. The last piece is playing with and practicing mindfulness. So What you see on the right is just a mindfulness scavenger hunt. A lot of these things get you outside. You're looking for specific colors. You're trying to find specific sounds, certain sensations. You can like write your answers or draw them, but this is like a family activity. There are a few sheets there and you try to see if you can find all the things. And again, it just gets you to like practice being very focused and intentional about your senses. The little craft on the left, this is make your own mindful pet. This is mainly just cute and fun. You cut this little creature out. You can fold it and make it. There are a few variations in how you can make this creature and how, what its ears are and what it's, things like that. And then the goal is like, okay, think about this creature's sensory profile. Like, what do they enjoy doing? What does their body need? Where do they like to be? This is from an old little activity we did where we had kids take a picture of their pet being mindful. So one of them is in bed, covering their eyes, being cozy. The other one is climbing a tree, lots of tactile input, climbing high, being happy in nature. And that is it. So I'm going to end the recording. I really appreciate you all for joining. I will stick around for questions. I do see one in here, so I will take that after I end the recording. And keep an eye out for the resources to come in to your email in the next day or so.